a fun experience for me because typically when I do these talks, I'm doing them for people who have only moved to Florida within the last decade. And let's put that up then. Typically when I do these lectures, it's only for people who've lived in Florida for about the past decade, and they have no idea that anyone lived here prior to maybe 1960. And so I'm a little intimidated because so many of you know so much about Hollywood, and I'll have to say Hollywood has not been top of my radar for much of what I teach. It will be from now on, now that I've had the opportunity to be here. But I do want to talk to you a little bit today about the land boom a century later. It's a transformative moment in Florida history. It's usually the time period when we divvy up Florida history, there are a few important dates that we use as sort of hinges. Maybe 1821 when Florida becomes a U.S. territory. 1865 maybe at the end of the Civil War, although for Florida the Civil War is far less important than, say, for Virginia. And the 1920s is really one of those hinge periods when we think about the direction in which Florida history was going really begins to shift. And so when I talk to you today about the land boom, I want you to keep that in mind, keeping in mind this as a turning point in Florida history. Really, Florida, and we know this if you from living in South Florida, try to imagine what South Florida looked like 110 years ago or 120 years ago. Do a little math in your mind. In Florida, at the turn of the last century, there were roughly 550,000 people in the state as a whole. And almost all of them lived within 100 miles of the Georgia line. The vast majority of them had been born in the South. Georgia or Alabama or South Carolina and Virginia really stand out. And Florida was the youngest state in the Union by far, with a population that was much younger demographically. Now, we think of Florida today, of course, right? Florida, we are at 23.5 million people. That population has doubled since 1980, basically. The vast majority of our population lives in South Florida. The 4 counties of South Florida, as you might count them, making up about 6 million people. That doesn't even count Southwest Florida, which I'm always going to just call Southwest Florida, because we're South Florida, even though geographically we're all South. And we are demographically the oldest population, except for some math in West Virginia currently keeps them a little older. And most of our folks come from folks who are not from the South. Right? We are from New York and New Jersey and those areas. And so the 20s is really the turning point at which that begins to shift. But there's other ways that it shifts as well. So the idea of South Florida really begins in this era. And the guy we usually credit for this, of course, is this bespectacled man here in the bottom right, Carl Fisher, who we often credit as sort of the leading developer of the region, although when we live here, right, we know of the others, particularly here in Hollywood, of Young in developing this area. But we often give him the credit for being the person who's able to get the spark going with this vision of South Florida, not as a remote, mosquito-infested, very hot, flat place that seemed just too far away from everywhere else, which is how most people would have described it in 1900. But as a man who could see South Florida as a place for recreation, a place for vacation, a sort of Riviera for the modern age. We see that here in his Miami Beach Roman pools. Fisher, of course, though, is not the first to think this. We should probably give some credit to our guy here, railroad magnate Henry Flagler, who develops first Palm Beach, West Palm Beach, and then by 1896 develops Miami, brings the railroad into Miami, developing all of this. Without Henry Flagler, it's not clear that any development in South Florida would have gone forward, particularly not on the timeline that we expect today. Because there's really no reason for him to have ever built a railroad down here, except for having a sort of vision that perhaps he could sell land to people and then maybe create a vacation space. We hope for Flagler, too, a sort of aesthetic of South Florida, the palm trees, and the idea of South Florida as a semi-tropical or subtropical recreation space. Of course, the palm trees are native, the royal palms and the coconut palms are native, or at least the coconut palms sort of are. But it was Flagler who hired his gardeners to make first the hotels beginning in St. Augustine, but then the hotels in Palm Beach and the hotels down in Miami to sort of stand out with this tropical aesthetic. The other person that on this coast we often don't give much credit to, but we probably should, for the development of Florida as a whole, is a guy named Henry Plant, also a railroad magnate who came to Florida around the same time that Henry Flagler did. They were friends, a little sort of friendly rivalry between the two, where Flagler had made his money at Standard Oil. Henry Plant had made his money in the railroad business. And he extended his Plant System Railroad, as you can see in this map, across central Florida, and particularly building Tampa as his hub for his railroad space. Plant, in some ways, developed more of the industrial side of Florida, opening up for the opening the railroads and the seaways for the cigar factories of Tampa, the phosphate mines of Central Florida, and much of the agriculture of Central Florida. But he also was a hotel builder too. Tampa, he built the Tampa Bay Hotel, which still stands with its famous onion dome minarets as the University of Tampa's main campus. Plant brings to Florida, along with Flagler, the first waves of people who begin to look at Florida as more than just this weird appendage at the bottom of the South. So without those two, really, there wouldn't have been much to start building on. But there are a few big differences that we might want to think of. And for this, I'd like to think of Carl Fisher here again. These are two pictures of Miami Beach. One, Miami Beach in its more natural state as a barrier island, filled with mangroves and other tropical hardwoods, being cleared by Carl Fisher's men in order to make the image that is on the right, the bathing beach that was built. While Flagler and Plant to some extent, Flagler in particular, helped to develop an aesthetic of South Florida, tropical aesthetic for Florida, Carl Fisher's idea was to simply make a new Florida in an image that he would like to see. He was one of the innovators in creating the transformative sorts of techniques for turning water into land, in particular with the dredge and fill system technique that has been widely used, much to the destruction of much of natural Florida, in creating Miami Beach, but also creating much of the development around Biscayne Bay. In doing this, I argue that Carl Fisher established a pattern for other developers who would come. No one could have envisioned South Florida with its very narrow stretch of the Atlantic coastal ridge as a place for widespread development. But once people began to believe that they could turn Florida into what they wanted Florida to be, draining the Everglades or building up beaches becomes the model for how we develop everything. And so ecologically, that as much as it is politically or economically a transformative moment in the 1920s, it's also an ecological turning point for this region. And within a few years, the idea of Florida also begins to take hold. I love this image. This is from the Pennsylvania Railroad. And much of the travel to South Florida well into the 1930s and 1940s would be on trains rather than automobiles, although we'll talk about those in a moment. If you were coming at that time, the train was the way to come. And here we have the Pennsylvania Railroad buying into this. You can imagine getting on the train at Penn Station or somewhere else, and here is the great vision: blue skies and white clouds, shady palm trees, and of course all of your friends happy to see you as you dine in this beautiful space. Right? And so this sort of image becomes quite popular as we've seen on these great posters that are put in here, these great images of how to sell Florida really begins to kick in. In some ways, these look to me almost timeless. All you have to do is update some of the features of it, and it would be an ad for Florida today in some ways. So that's in some ways some of our, you can see that in some of these other ads. I love this Lauderdale Isles one here that you're not on the sort of rough ocean, but instead you can see the elements of the dredge and fill, which creates these sort of peaceful canals, people dressed for tennis, for golf, for bathing, for fishing. That's an amazing fish that guy pulled out of the canal. And everything is beautiful and sublime, right? This sort of image. Now you have to remember who this is advertising to: people in New York City or the Northeast in February, right? And so we keep that in mind. The beauty of that escape. Notice it's always wealthy too. This is not a sort of image of Florida. Yeah.
Is that an actual location, or is that all imagination?
This is all imagination, right? As best I can tell, these are all imaginative tellings. You can imagine a time when they could...
Like that building with the dome on the top there. Is that a real building? Or?
I really don't know if that is or not. That's good to notice. So, yeah, but if you go through certain parts of Fort Lauderdale, you can imagine a time when they thought the canals would be just this accessible, right? That everyone would come back, would have that ease of access there. The other one for Croissant Park in Fort Lauderdale creates this sort of, points us to this sort of image of this mishmash of Spanish, Italianate, sort of tropical ideal for the houses today, the houses of that day. But the beautiful color and the printing, that's very expensive printing for the time to do that. We have some that are a little less expensive. These I received, well, here's one for the Hollywood Water and Land Company here. It's not exactly fancy, but it does, I use it for the language, right? A city of prosperity and happiness, Hollywood by the sea, but also as an industrial city. So some marketers like Young, not just envisioning this as a fly-by-night space, but as a place to build a new society. In some ways, Addison Meisner, which is the ad there on the left, had a similar idea. I love in Meisner's image, let's see if I can make that bigger. I've never really done this much with these. But
oh, wow.
So Meisner's has this, so the world circling, the people circling the world. And you all ever heard that expression that the United States sort of leans to the southeast and all the nuts roll down into Florida? Meisner had this idea, apparently, that people would simply flock to places like Boca Raton. Now, when you all are more familiar with Young, Addison Meisner was an architect in Palm Beach who decided, sort of late in the game, the boom really starts right around World War I, around the time the United States is getting into World War I. That's when people start looking. That's when Fisher starts building Miami Beach, about 1915, 1916. And it takes him really a decade to get all of that done. Meisner gets in the game a little late. He'd been designing houses for the wealthy in Palm Beach and decides about 1922 or 1923 to get in to try to build Boca Raton. And in Boca Raton, he brings this Spanish-style architecture that he designs, builds the Boca Raton Resort as a way to try to attract tourists, just as every other developer was doing. Meisner ultimately goes bankrupt and fails. I'm going to give the story away for most of these guys. They go bankrupt and fail in doing it.
Yeah.
But they have a sort of grand vision for what this place might become. Fisher's Miami Beach, of course, these are great examples of the sort of environmental transformation that went on. Here you have the causeway up here on the upper left. The causeways, which you can see in a picture over here on the right. essentially what had been a barrier island filled with mangroves. He had began to turn into this sort of tropical paradise for everyone. Initially, Fisher advertised for the wealthy, and they saw no reason to come. The old money, they saw no reason to come further south than Palm Beach. And so in the 20s, the teens in the 20s, he began advertising it to his set, the sort of nouveau riche set, who saw this as potentially their place to make a mark in the world. So here we have, this one stands out. Miami Beach, really the epicenter of much of that development. Also, George Merrick's Coral Gables, where Fisher came in and did a partnership with John Collins to get some of the land. George Merrick had inherited what was essentially a cattle ranch from his family and decided to begin turning that part into a tropical escape as well, but not as vacation, but as homes and complete neighborhoods, and in fact an entire city with a university included, trying to make this some grander vision. So sometimes, often because of the way the boom turns out, I'm going to give it away, it busts. By the way the boom turns out, our vision of South Florida and Florida generally has often been one where it's been sort of stained by the swindling movements, right? The binder boys that would sell you property really fast before you would trade it again. And the slogan, right, of buying land by the gallon, that is sort of staying in right ahead of the dredge, keeping everyone, tricking people into buying property. And unfortunately, Florida has earned that reputation. For a century now, we've been the sunny place for shady people. That's all I can say. Right? But I want to give some credit to these developers, whether it's Young here in Hollywood, Carl Fisher, despite his failures in Miami Beach, George Merrick, in particular George Merrick in Coral Gables. These were people with vision, right? Sort of trying to build something where there was nothing, trying to turn it into something, not just a land deal they could swap.
That's the Venetian Pool in Coral Gables. Johnny Weismuller was used to promote that.
That's right. They would bring this is the Venetian Pool.
Also in Hollywood.
Yeah.
At the casino.
And they would bring in the famous. They would bring in as a way to sell the properties. All the Babe Ruth, George. The most famous, who's not famous today, in selling Coral Gables was William Jennings Bryan. So William Jennings Bryan, the great political orator of the late 19th century. He'd been Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson. His daughter then becomes Florida's first female representative, Ruth Bryan Owen, later on. But because he's related to Merrick, they bring him in, and he would sit there on the Miami River waving to the people coming in, trying to buy them, to convince them to buy this property. If you want to have any more critical, eye towards what Merrick had envisioned, the whole idea of building a university where there was barely a town, right, is sort of visionary for doing that. You all have heard the joke about the University of Miami. We're going to build a university in Miami. Is it going to be in Miami? No, it's not going to be in Miami. It's going to be in Coral Gables. Will anybody from Miami go to the University of Miami? No, they're all going to come from New Jersey. That's just a tease. So I like to give more credit than others might to the sort of vision that they had in building all of these things. And Meisner, again, is another one of these in building this. Meisner is probably the closest of the developers that I talk about here to being the guy who's almost ready to swap land for money just to get you in the door. The Meisner developments came sort of late. By the time 1926 rolls around, not many purchasers. It became one of those situations where you had so many developments in so many different places. Why would you buy in Boca Raton, 40 miles north of Miami, when you could buy in Fort Lauderdale or in Hollywood or someplace closer to Miami. So he was sort of at the outer reaches of this, but again, some of that great vision and sort of spectacle is part of it. Another one that we don't talk about over here, though, is and one of our things in South Florida that we often overlook is that the land boom was in fact statewide, except for maybe the northern part of the state. Right? And nobody's selling land in Pensacola at this rate, but people in Tampa did try. And in Sarasota, you had the Ringlings who began to develop that space. And in Tampa, the developer was a guy named David Davis, who, despite having all of the land of Central Florida potentially available to him, decided to follow Carl Fisher's model and build something called Davis Islands, just south of downtown Tampa. So if you've ever been to Tampa, this up here is downtown. And Davis Islands was just a series of little tidal islands that sat out there. But you can see by the 1930s had been completely dredged and filled and created an entire space of community with golf courses and all of those things. I always like to include him because I'm from Tampa and grew up with some knowledge of Davis Islands as also being part of the land boom. And he was able to attract a number of people to move there, even though South Florida remained the epicenter. Plus, I just love this image of simply creating a city from the sea and serving it up for folks. And that ad, of course, where I got this ad was the Philadelphia Inquirer, because that's who they're trying to sell land to throughout all of this. And so we think of it in other places, and of course here's just a sort of mishmash. There's another Hollywood by the Sea one. I've forgotten which ones were in here exactly. So you had a Hollywood by the Sea there with the hotel, the resort. Of course, Hialeah, which had a pronunciation guide that they eventually took out, so you learn how to pronounce it there. You had Sarasota. There's your Altos Del Mar sign as well. And another one in Tampa that they were going to build called Tampa Beach. And back to your idea of Johnny Weissmuller, when they were trying to build Tampa Beach, they had Red Grange and the entire Chicago Bears brought in by train in order to try to convince people from Chicago to come buy land in Tampa. Many of these were never fully developed, so Tampa Beach was never developed. It's now it now serves as the sort of industrial port for Tampa. Others were completed. It becomes sort of a mishmash, and others change their meaning over time. You can see in the Hialeah sign, they're selling for farms, vegetable gardens, citrus groves at reasonable prices. I'm not sure you'd find a farm in Hialeah anywhere today. Lots of mangoes, but not maybe that. So the question comes down is, well, why? All right. So for a historian, we can get caught up in all of the detail of all of these places, but we have to ask, well, why does it happen in the 1920s? What is it about the United States? What is it about that moment in American history that really helps set that apart? Well, some of them are structural changes that we want to keep in mind that might seem obvious, but they're really important for explaining this story. And one of those is that the 1920s really becomes the automobile age. Without the automobile, transportation to Florida prior to the airplane would have been much more limited for most people. Right? You could get here by train, but the trains took you only to particular places. The development of all of Florida, that is, right, so you could get on Flagler's Railroad, but you would be stuck right along the coast. How do we account for development in Sarasota and other places? And so the automobile is one of those great ways, great sort of liberators that helps to bring people here. We also have the structural change. The increasing numbers of people are white-collar workers who have opportunity to come to Florida they have this thing now called a vacation. They're able to come for longer periods of time. And so it's not just limited to those who were fairly wealthy. The middle class increasingly could come, the automobile maybe being their preferred way of coming. At the same time, and I'll throw this in here quickly, you have this appeal to farmers as well. So much of the east coast of Florida, of course, Flagler is selling them on the ability to create winter gardens and winter farms. They could farm in Michigan or they could farm in New Jersey during the winter and come down here during the summer and come down here during the winter and have that second season. So the railroad helps with a lot of that. But the automobile sort of frees people up. On the upper left, what that's a picture of, those are tin can tourists. That was an organization of these tourists. They would turn their Model A's and Model T's into any sort of vehicle you wanted it to be, essentially, and they would come and camp for the season in the parks, a sort of working class kind of recreation that could be done. They called themselves the tin can tourists, not only because of their cars, but because they happen to live out of tin cans for most of the season. Right? Some of the other ads are great for this as well. I'll make this one bigger. I love this Meisner went motor down to Florida for a glorious winter. The American motorist, I can guarantee that picture was taken on the banks of Tampa Bay. This is, as you can see, it's 1924 in the image down there. Sort of imagine you're sitting and it's somewhere cold, right? This beautiful image of not even having to be at a resort, but just this open coastal space where everybody can enjoy it. So in the 20s, there's a sort of democratic ideal that develops to coming to Florida. And Matt Meisner caught it in this one as well, with the idea of the return of the covered wagon. Right? Instead of everyone racing west to build bonanza farms, everyone could move south to Florida to build their lives. Right? And so you even see it here. If you look closely, the sort of spirit of the frontier in driving these automobiles south. Now, what is it that makes the automobile possible? Of course, are new highways. And key among these, of course, is Carl Fisher's Dixie Highway. That connection between him and this highway building in Miami Beach should never be overlooked. Fisher had been a leader in the automobile industry. He developed, he bought patents and a few other things and got his way into there. As most of you probably know, he built the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, was really big into those things. But he also understood that if the automobile industry was going to flourish, Americans needed better than dirt roads that they could barely cross, right? And so at first he builds the Lincoln Highway connecting Los Angeles with Chicago, and then builds the Dixie Highway that then connects the Chicago, the Midwest, with the South. The Dixie Highway, as we still have it here, right? It was a main thoroughfare for getting people to South Florida. This lovely map shows you the sort of breakdown once you enter in at the St. Mary's River and works your way down all the way here. And I had to drive about half of that Friday night on 95, and I can tell you those miles seem very long. Even today, but I always, every time I head off in Florida and I do this talk about automobiles, I try to imagine what that must have been like at 35 miles an hour coming down here with no air conditioning. But in the winter it would have been beautiful, right? Fisher, in Florida too, this map doesn't show it. In Florida, the state had the benefit that the Dixie Highway actually had two spokes to it, or two routes. So the Dixie Highway also came down through the central part of Florida, in addition to the eastern route that brought people to the south. So that helped to develop some of this. At the same time, other roads are developed. The federal government passed in 1916 the first Federal Highway Act, which provided for the construction of our U.S. highway system. So US 1, for example, was built in that time period. In the middle of the 1920s, you had the construction of the Tamiami Trail, which begins in Tampa and ends in Miami, but also is the first road to cross the Everglades. So in this period, there is a boom in road construction that helps to fill in some of those areas, or at least was designed to help fill in some of the state. That's still a big thing today, right? So developers today, they usually now have the state build toll highways, toll roads to connect different places, almost guaranteeing that development would move forward. In addition to the other piece of explaining why this happens in the 1920s is not only was the infrastructure here as imperfect as it was and as incomplete as it was, and I should add, I don't really have this in the slides, but I'll add this as well. Right, drainage is also the big story in South Florida. And drainage starts about 1905, really gets a kick though after World War I, when the federal government is sort of put on the hook for draining out the Everglades. And so you have an expansion in the number of canals beginning in the late 19-teens into the early 1920s. And so that canal building boom for drainage is also a big piece, particularly in South Florida for here. So the infrastructure starts to develop. But the 1920s also proves a perfect period for this because people are able to sell Florida as an investment. And so if you remember your American history, right? American history is the post-war years, the United States is at an economic high point, right? It goes from being goes from being what's described as a debtor nation, right, with large outside investment, to being a creditor nation, to being the largest creditor nation on earth, right? After World War I, there's all these German patents that American companies are able to nationalize, and so they begin to become profitable. And so there's a great deal of economic growth in the 1920s. And a lot of the money that people have, they're looking for investments. The stock market, of course, becomes the big one, but others also begin looking at Florida land as a potential investment. And so in that environment, Florida becomes not only a place for settlers that people like Meisner or people like Merrick or Fisher or Young or others might envision, it also becomes a space for investors whom are looking to double and triple their profits. And by doing that, they created a sort of frenzy for buying Florida land. That's what I love about this middle image here. Here's a person, they go to the mailbox, right? Mail's getting mighty all fired heavy of late, right? And every flyer they have is Florida, get rich in Florida, right? So buy some Florida land now. If you don't buy it now, you're going to be in there too late, right? Or you're going to miss out. What opportunity are you going to miss? I wonder if Florida Florida developers still sell these. I think they do. I think the villages today has people selling this. In Florida, of course, they send us ones from North Carolina, telling all of us it's time to buy North Carolina land, right? So these are some great images of this. So you have the Blaine's latest greatest land offering, $15 an acre. 10 acres for $150, and people are pressured to buy it essentially sight unseen. As you probably know the famous story, right, of the Miami Herald running to over 800 pages at one point, filled with land ads. You would get off the stories where you would get off the railroad, get off the land in town, and 15 developers would be ready to hit you up to put you on a bus to go out and see their land, or there would be somebody there ready to sell you a piece of property as soon as you got off, right? And then the great stories of people buying a property and it changing hands 5 and 6 times before it even got to the deed office to set somebody to set the deed on it. Right, those stories of the frenzy are not, they might be hyperbolic to an extent, but they're not untrue. Right, the sort of frenzy of buying Florida land. You see this one, the Sarasota one, all roads lead to Sarasota and her investment opportunities. So it's not just an attempt to bring people here, to bring everybody here to settle, but to give them some great opportunity to buy. I love the image down on the bottom right. That's the land sales office in Boca Raton. And so you can see them in their shirt sleeves and their saddle shoes, right, ready to sell and buy land and move quickly. Right? So part of it is an investment program, and cheesecake didn't hurt either. Right? So Carl Fisher is often credited with being the man who figured out that cheesecake could sell. The image in the middle is sort of the earliest images of South Florida as a beach space. This is a new thing, right? Up through the late 19th century, most people don't go to the shore for much of anything. right? The idea of laying out and sunning yourself was not popular. The people with the biggest tans were the people who worked out in the sun, who had to work, right? So to tan yourself was not necessarily a point of pride. And for farmers, beaches aren't interesting because it's mostly it's all sand, so they're not wanting to be near the shore. But in the late 19th century, there's this sort of turn. We see it in places like Coney Island, where the idea of recreation by the sea, kind of mixing with ideas about sea air being healthier for you in these fetid cities that are all filled with tuberculosis, right? Go to the sea, get some of that fresh air, that'll make you better. So this idea of recreation by the sea increases in popularity. Now that middle image there, those are relatively chaste images of mid-century or early 20th century swimsuits, right? They're still wearing the swimming stockings. Except for the shoulders, most of the body is still covered. Swim caps still being quite popular. But that image sort of begins to resonate. Fisher is the one who's often has said that he wanted to see the smallest swimsuits he could find and no more swim tights. He wanted to see bare legs. And so the image over on the right, that is the beauty of South Beach, right? The idea of bringing people here to see beautiful women and to have that sort of hedonistic escape becomes increasingly tied to Florida. It's also important to remember, and I don't really have a slide for this, it's important to remember what's the other big event of the 1920s? What do we think of usually when we think of the 1920s? Prohibition, right? There's the one I'm looking for, right? So nowhere can you buy alcohol. Legally, nowhere can you buy alcohol in the United States, right? But in Florida, the irony is, Florida, it goes dry before the rest of the country does. The rest of the country doesn't go dry until the 1920s. Florida goes dry in 1917 because the politics in Florida was driven by North Florida Methodists and Baptists who, as they used to say, staggered their way to the polls to vote dry, right? So, it was mostly a way of creating a sort of image. You could get alcohol anywhere easily in Florida, and it was abetted by the fact that you could go 60 miles east and be in the Bahamas, or 90 miles south and get it from Cuba. And so rum and everything else is flowing freely everywhere here in Florida. So the idea of Florida as hedonist escape begins to take hold as well, right, in the 1920s. So we have a lot of factors that help to bring this together, and a lot of developers willing to sort of help meet the vision for what people wanted in this era. So why did it end? Well, we have a sort of short, normal story we're told, but we need to put that in context. So the story we're usually given is that one big hurricane hit the place, and everyone got scared and left. It's kind of true. It began to slow down because, like all bubbles, people began to realize as early as late 1924 and throughout 1925 that potentially there wouldn't be a bubble forever. If you look at the housing starts, there were a couple of structural problems. There was a ship blocking the Miami harbor that had keeled over on its side and was blocking the harbor. There was also a railroad strike in 1925 that helped to slow down the pace of building and building materials. And so, but there's also this sort of sense that at some point bubbles will pop. So there's a slowdown if we look structurally. And the same is true if we look at the Great Depression. We say, well, why did the Great Depression happen? Well, we like to say this is the stock market crash. And historians look back and say, no, if you look at it, there's already a sort of structural weakness kicking in earlier. The 1926 hurricane in that way served as sort of the stock market crash for Florida. It's great symbolism, and it was important, but the bubble was already weakening by 1926 when the hurricane came in. The September hurricane, though, was terrifying, came right over the center of Miami. People didn't know what to do because most of them had never dealt with a hurricane. They went out during the sunny period, not realizing that was just the eye, and then hit them again as it came through. In Florida, they tried to embargo most of the news about the storm. They tried to downplay how bad it was and how much damage it did to the epicenter there at Miami Beach. But Miami Beach was covered in sand by the time it was all done, and people began to look for ways to get out as quickly as they could. The bubble really keeps on, right? It doesn't die. In 1926, 1927, boosters continued to try to get people to buy land. They trying to keep this going. But in 1928, of course, you have another hurricane that goes right over West Palm Beach and then over Lake Okeechobee, flooding Pahokee and Belglade. The 26 hurricane had flooded Moorhaven, killing thousands throughout that. And once those news reports come in, it's really much harder to keep the boom going. Investors sought, and of course the technical reason a boom fails is every investor's trying to sell out as quickly as they can, and prices begin to plummet. Brilliant people who could buy at the end of all that bought it. Al Capone, among others, right? Comes into South Florida, begins buying up property where they can. And so the boom never ends entirely. Florida is not a ghost town after the 1920s, but it does slow the pace of development significantly. So what does it mean? That's where, as a historian, that's what we call the so what question. You ever want to see a graduate student just look completely deflated? Have them tell you a great story, and then you go, well, so what? That's what my dissertation advisor did to me, and so we do it to them. What did it all mean? What's all this mean? Well, I have a couple of ideas for why I think this is important. One is that it does create the idea of Florida in the American mind, for good or ill. And I think mostly, well, I'm still ambivalent on it sometimes. I grew up in Florida, and if any of you did, you know the ambivalence maybe that comes from growing up and living here sometimes, especially when you're born and raised here. You love the place, and sometimes you hate the place. And I tell my students that every semester in Florida history. I said, mine's kind of like one of those, you ever seen those boxes that has water in it? And you turn it from one side to the other, and the water all rushes, and then it comes back, and then it depends on the day and how much of the newspaper I've been reading, whether I love or hate this place. If I've been driving across Central Florida at sundown, I am completely in love with this place, and will be forever. It's my home. But Florida takes on in people's minds as a place of escape, not just a mosquito backwater, swampy place, but as a place where they can go to the beach, a place where they can be in the sun, a place where there can maybe be some greater future for them. And I think that the developers of the 1920s did a good job of selling us and creating that image for us. It also creates, in some ways, this Florida style that we live with. This would not be, the building style has changed over the last 20 years. So currently we're into the museum modern, I think is that's what they call this. The construction of large boxes on where other people's houses used to be. If I showed you this picture, though, this is the Venetian pool in Coral Gables. If I'd shown you this picture in 2005, made it a little fresher, took the people out of it from swimming, I could have sold you that as a brand new development in St. Lucie County. Yeah. Right? The idea of this sort of Florida stucco Spanish Mediterranean style, which is it's none of them purely. It's sort of an imaginative space, has been our style for a century. Some people love it, some people hate it, but this style, with all of its bougainvilleas and tropical plants, as invasive as they are, I had to cut a 30-foot carrot wood out of my yard 2 weeks ago, so I'm a little embittered about invasive plants at the moment. But we understand this is our aesthetic, and this aesthetic is stuck with us and remains a very popular one for us even today. Florida not as it is, because Florida as it is a little bit prickly, right? How many of us would live here without air conditioning? A few of you. How many of you would live here without mosquito control? Yeah, right? Florida can be a little prickly. It's not gorgeous on the grand scale unless you're looking at the sky. The Everglades is not easy to love. But this style allows us to paint color in where Florida might not be the most colorful all the time. I don't know if you've ever read Harriet Beecher Stowe's Palmetto Leaves. Harriet Beecher Stowe, of course, is the abolitionist writer. She moves to Florida in the 1870s, or in the 1860s. And she writes a book called Palmetto Leaves. And it's a series of letters to her northern friends about Florida. And she has this great image of Florida as a tapestry. But it's both sides of the tapestry. That Florida on one side is gorgeous and beautiful, ornate and well built. But you turn the tapestry over, and as she says, it's all the thrums. It's all the little pieces of string. And what she was hoping to do, though, is help people appreciate that beauty as well. And I'm from Florida, and I'm from that part of Florida where the thrums are, not the beautiful side. And so I'm always an advocate for remembering that Florida is beautiful everywhere. But this image of Florida is a beautiful one that has remained with us even today. And so we want to credit the 20s with that. But we also need to think of those ecological consequences. This is an image I created with just mashing two images together. Right? That the Florida that's kind of prickly, in order for people to live here, was made into a Florida that maybe isn't exactly as it always is. And we've faced the consequences of that even today as we're going forward. Not that I want to tell everyone to move. I don't know how many people this state can hold. People have asked me that in the past. How many can continue to move here? And I don't know. It's still pretty empty in North Florida, so maybe they'll pack into there at some point. And I don't know that it's my right, even from someone born here, to tell someone they can't come here and enjoy the beautiful things that we have. But I want us as Floridians to at least acknowledge that maybe the way they didn't in the 1920s, that they maybe couldn't have even envisioned in the 1920s, that building the Florida we have comes with consequences, both for us and for the future. And 100 years from now, I'm hoping that we'll say that some of the legacies of this place and of our time is that we faced those challenges and we're able to build an even better Florida. Thank you very much for your time.